Morning, Professor Spooner. How are you?
Good morning, Frank. I'm fine, thanks, and I hope you are too. The weather is terrific.
It is.
Well, the most newsworthy things in the past week that relate in some way to globalization, I think, all have to do with something that you wouldn't expect us to be talking about, which is royalty. First, a new royal baby, and it's really quite amazing how interested, how many people have been
Oh,
amazingly interested in this.
yes.
And I've not, I mean, even you might expect that this would be an opportunity for criticism of royalty. What the hell are these people doing? And how are they earning their living? And am I paying for it? And that
Mm.
sort of thing. And it's been the opposite. And then the other thing that happened after that was the abdication of the Emperor of Japan, who happens to be more or less the same age as me, and whom I met once and had an
Really?
interesting conversation with
Really?
just before he actually became emperor. So that must have been just over 30 years ago, because he had spent his younger days studying Iran,
Oh,
which
my.
because I spent a lot of my time studying. And we had a very interesting conversation. So he's one of two royal figures that I've had a relationship, who've both now left their posts.
Well, wait a minute. Hold
Um,
on. Who's the other one?
the king of Iran, the Shah of
Oh,
Iran,
all right. Reza Pahlavi.
which I don't usually mention since 1979.
This is wise.
Uh,
Yes. Yes.
uh, anyway, the I would not have thought of relating this to globalization until a colleague of mine, with whom I've been working closely on courses on globalization for the last 19 years, um, gave a talk about it and pointed out that royalty, in fact, which is still important in, he said, 40 countries in the world. I'm not sure how he counted them because I tried Google and Google didn't give me that answer, didn't give me an answer at all. But certainly a lot of European countries, apart from places like Jordan and other parts of the world. He said that these provide a focus, a symbolism of national unity, which obviously we don't have in the United States, so that whoever's in charge of the government, and whatever we think of the way the government is running, in England, in places like England, it doesn't have any impact on our sense of national unity. And he talked for, I don't know, probably about 15 minutes about how useful this actually has been politically over the last century. And that all the countries which, I mean, obviously, China and America are the world's two largest economies, and China lost its emperor a century ago, and America is America because it rebelled against an emperor.
Right. Right.
However, on a smaller scale, the countries that have monarchies are all doing very well.
Well,
So this is particularly interesting because as globalization progresses and as we get further into what I've called the crucial phase of globalization, where people are resisting it and causing problems because of their resistance, we particularly need symbols of identity that will hold people together.
well,
And what's going to happen if with a fully globalized world, because we've still not worked out any way to organize anything on a larger scale than the nation state.
I think your colleague is definitely onto something. I think when you talk about resistance to globalization, it, in my mind, is almost synonymous in some ways with social divisiveness, which is certainly what we're seeing in the United States today. and seeing it elsewhere around the world, but not so much in countries that do have royalty. And in the United States, at least, the executive function of the presidency had traditionally been cloaked somewhat with a hint of imperial kind of grandeur, which would allow the president to transcend when needed, party politics and serve as this is going to sound a little kooky, but to serve as the father of the country. And I'm thinking back
with
to
executive privilege.
with exactly. I'm thinking back to George W. Bush, who way back when in 2001, when he had been in office only for 8.5 months, had sort of been viewed as a bit of a buffoon, giving that eulogy or that talk at the National Cathedral after the September 11th attacks, bringing the country together, and that doesn't seem to be here now in this country. And I don't want to devolve into discussions about President Trump, but if you juxtapose it a little bit and think about what would be going on now if there was a king or a queen in the United States, would there be a greater sense of security and reassurance on the part of all the people who might be politically divided or socially divided? I think the answer is two thumbs up. Yeah, there would be a greater sense of cohesiveness and national identity. So I think your colleague is correct. It's interesting.
I should have said constitutional monarchies, actually, just to be clear about the fact
Sure.
that there's a distinction between a constitutional monarchy and a dictatorship.
Of course.
But of course, in America, to some extent, the Constitution takes the place of the monarch.
Yes, but all right. So let me.
The problem is that the Constitution doesn't change, whereas one of the things that my colleague pointed out was that monarchies have been changing.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about this? Because if you look at the United Kingdom, for example, all right, where the country is essentially polarized over the Brexit policy, 50-50. Certainly, 100% of the people in England or the United Kingdom understand that there's a bit of a romanticized fiction going on collectively as to how they view the royal family. They understand that they're not imperial. They can't order beheadings. They can't order policy changes. And it's just sort of a nice to have, almost fairy tale kind of scenario that periodically, when the birth of a royal baby, 8 millionth in line for the throne, is about to emerge into the world, everything stops and people are glued to their iPhones waiting for the naming of the baby. And is it some sort of social or society self-delusion that's going on as sort of a safety valve to make sure that things don't get too out of hand in the divisiveness that's going on, where when if they left to their own devices, they'd be slugging each other about Brexit? How do you see that?
The most interesting thing about the new baby is that the father is a direct descendant of the current monarch, but the mother is biracial in the terms that are usually used, and is from another country and is a commoner.
Yes.
Now, this sort of thing could not have happened 50 years ago.
No.
And now it's being talked about as a modernization of the monarchy, which is interesting because when the monarch was the head of the British Empire, even though she was still a constitutional monarch, she was called the emperor or empress. That could never have happened because being English was the most important thing and being royal rather than a commoner. So it's interesting that these things are changing. And of course, similar changes have been happening in the other constitutional monarchies of Europe. of which it's not so easy to find the details, but because they're much less, what shall I say, the symbolism of them is not projected beyond their borders in the way that the symbolism of the British monarch tends to be.
Right, right. But I have many business associates in London, and one-on-one, when you talk about the royal family with them, they'll roll their eyes and almost seem somewhat embarrassed by them that this unusual anachronism is still in place at the top of the society. And they'll also be on both sides of the spectrum insofar as the Brexit policy is concerned. But what is it? Is it some intentional self-delusion that they're exhibiting that lets them have this higher concept of a king or a queen that they're willing to allow exist in their mind with the understanding that it ties them all together? I mean, I'm a little unclear on the mechanism here.
Well, it's symbolism. It symbolizes much more than England. It symbolizes the unity of a larger set of relationships of the United Kingdom, for example. I mean, the United Kingdom would not have been a United Kingdom without the royalty. And if Scotland does decide to leave the United Kingdom, then of course it will. The most obvious thing about it would be that it will be separating itself from the monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course there's the Commonwealth. I forget now the number. It's a very large number of states that recognize the Queen as the head of the Commonwealth. So the political significance of the monarchy is really important in this time. So even people who think that the monarchy is pointless in England, nevertheless, I think recognize what it does for our what shall I say, our international situation.
Well, I agree on if we run it out in that direction, but if we run it back in the other direction, in the narrowest focus, almost household by household by household, where tremendous differences exist, whether they be economic or political or religious differences, there is still a tremendous unifying glue that the monarchy is able to bring down to that granular level. Something that's lacking in this country right now, for example.
Yeah, yeah. It would be perhaps politically inadvisable, but nevertheless philosophically very interesting to have some open discussion of the usefulness of the monarchy in England at the moment, just to see what people would say. Mm-hmm. And relate it. And in fact, what we need is a research study of monarchies in the modern world, and comparing not just about the British monarchy, but about all the others that are there, and seeing if they are actually playing a similar role in the current.
Let me ask you a question. When your colleague gives this talk to students who are presumably mostly younger people, what is their reaction?
Well, that I'm afraid I can't tell you, because I just happened to find this in my email, and listen to it. It's on the Wharton website.
Okay.
The Wharton School website. So anybody can go and listen to it there. But I have no idea what the reaction of the students would have been. But if our students here are, of course, from all over the place. And, I don't know what percentage of them are actually American. I'm not sure there's anybody from England at all, but they're from certainly different parts of Asia and the Americas.
And do you think there are other transcendent types of figures that even step beyond a national monarchy? People like the Dalai Lama come to mind, the Pope, for example, others. I mean, I'm as somebody who feels as a disembodied American right now, who is scarred by the social divisiveness that is going on here in this country, where you're cautious and afraid of engaging in discussion with people that you don't know until you understand their political affiliations. I'm looking for safe ground, and I'm
Well,
where is it?
you've asked a good question, and the answer, I think, begins in this way. That in fact was begun by my colleague, which is that the Queen has not said anything in the past 50 years that has any political significance. So she's managed to remain totally symbolic. The Pope has become quite political in the last few years because of the sexual abuse problem. And the same is true. Of course, the United Nations should be developing some sort of what should I say, comparable position, but has completely failed doing that. The Dalai Lama, I read some interesting things about Buddhism over the past week. There's absolutely nothing that unifies the Buddhist community in the way that the Pope remains a symbol of Christian unity, even though he's not recognized as the leader by all Christians. And Islam is institutionally, what should I say, unitary. Or it tries to be, even though, of course, we have this problem between Saudi Arabia representing Sunni Islam and Iran representing Shia Islam. But what I was reading about Buddhism said that a lot of Buddhists have never heard of the Dalai Lama.
That's a little hard to believe.
Well, I mean, he's recognized by a relatively small branch of what's happened socially in Buddhist history.
Is he Hinayana or Mahayana? I can never remember.
Well, I'm not sure as he's thought of as in either terms, actually, because Hinayana and Mahayana, I think, are used more by people talking about Buddhism from the outside than they are about people I think this is the problem that well, it's a philosophical problem for us, but it doesn't seem to bother Buddhists.
So in a funny way, as globalization intensifies and we continue to progress through this crucial phase, in fact, the security and legacy of the monarchies seems to be being strengthened.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens to it as globalization progresses. Of course, I've been suggesting that we should forget about the European Union and focus on the Commonwealth and see if we can expand the Commonwealth. It would be much more productive in the long term than competing with France and Germany in Europe.
Well, that may be where England ends up turning, depending upon how things happen. You never know. They're lucky they have this built-in alternative there that they could hopefully activate somehow into an economic kind of component. So, all right. Well, Professor, thank you very much. This was very interesting this morning. We appreciate your time and look forward to discussing more with you next week.
Yes. See you next week.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.